An academic at the heart of a controversial unfair dismissal case has been vindicated after a tribunal ruled his anti-Zionist comments during a university lecture were worthy of respect. While the court took his side, it raises a bigger question. Should courts really be deciding which opinions we should be respecting and which we shouldn't? Well, I'm joined now by the man at the centre of the story, the former professor of sociology, David Miller. Professor, thank you very much for joining me. The question really here is, are you anti-Semitic?
Well, the question that the court was asked to determine was in part, was I anti-Semitic? And the court determined that I was not anti-Semitic. And indeed, the university had itself had 3 separate investigations, 2 by an external QC, all of which determined I was not anti-Semitic. They included rather that my views were anti-Zionist, and the courts concluded that the reason I was sacked was because my views were anti-Zionist. The university was so freaked out by the idea of an anti-Zionist that they had to sack me. And if I had said everything else that I had said, absent the anti-Zionist views, I would not have been sacked. So that's what the court thought.
So when you said August last year, that Judophobia barely exists these days, and the facts, 1, Jews are not discriminated against, 2, they are overrepresented in Europe, North America and Latin America in positions of cultural, economic and political power, 3, they are therefore in a position to discriminate against actually marginalised groups. That wasn't classic anti-Semitic commentary on Twitter?
That's correct. It's not classic anti-Semitism. It's actually...
So Jews are overrepresented in positions of power is the classic conspiracy theory against the Jews?
Well, the evidence that I quoted in the thread all came from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, from government-funded research. This is well known. It's well known that Jews are the most advantaged section of the population, economically speaking, and of course are overrepresented in positions of power in Parliament, in journalism, in finance, and many other places. Whether you think that's anti-Semitic or not, it is true. This ties in with what you were saying about the Bristol JSOC, which is all reported in the judgment, that you say it's part of a Zionist, pro-Israel, well-funded organisation. Again, absolutely the classic anti-Jewish tropes that the Jews are well-funded, international conspiracy, working against our interests. Isn't that classic anti-Semitism? Well, no, there's no mention of international. It's simply factual. I mean, I've been doing research on the Zionist movement for many years. It's simply factually the case that the university's Jewish Society, which is formally Zionist, and the Union of Jewish Students, formally Zionist, were attacking me. And so also simply the case, as Al Jazeera showed in its documentary, they're funded by the Israeli embassy. And they're dedicated to pursuing Zionism on campus. These are facts. Whether you think that's anti-Semitic or not is maybe down to you, but they are factual statements.
What I would point out to you is that when you say this is a direct member of the World Zionist Organization for a university Jewish society, you are basically going back to the classic anti-Semitism of saying the Jews are organized globally and they are using this for reasons of power, and that ties in with your tweet of last August. So you use Zionism as cover for anti-Semitism.
No, we don't. It's not called the World Jewish Organization. It's called the World Zionist Organization. They're not members of it as Jews. They're members.
But they are called the Bristol Jewish Society, aren't they? They're not called the Bristol Zionist Society.
They're not a member of any World Jewish Organization. They're a member of a World Zionist Organization, which of course does what it says in the tin. It promotes Zionism.
So you're saying that the Bristol Jewish Society is promoting Zionism because they're Jewish, and then you're saying that's not anti-Semitic. I just don't get how you get out of the anti-Semitic position.
It's not. This is absurd. They're promoting Zionism because they are Zionists. Not all Jews are Zionists, not all Zionists are Jews, but the Jewish society on campus is a Zionist society. It's formally Zionist. It could tomorrow, as I wish it would, resign from the Zionist movement and pledge to represent all Jews. It doesn't do that at present. It excludes anti-Zionist or non-Zionist Jews from membership and from participation in its activities. So I wish that they would represent all Jews, but they don't.
But wouldn't that be fine if you hadn't said, in addition, that Jews are not discriminated against, which we know is not true? We've seen a lot of discrimination against Jews in recent times.
We don't know that. But the only way in which you can show that there is discrimination against Jews, they're not discriminated against at an economic level. They're overrepresented in public life.
No, just because they're overrepresented doesn't mean they're not discriminated against. They could be even more overrepresented if they weren't discriminated against. They may be overrepresented because they're brilliant.
Oh, because they're brilliant. Well, you can make that argument, and that is an argument which is made by people who believe in race science. I don't particularly believe in that stuff, but yes, they are overrepresented. And the question is how one deals with that in a society which is supposed to be egalitarian. Now, my view is that it's not just a question of the status of Jews in the society. It's a question of how that links to the genocide in Gaza. So the fact is that Zionist organizations, every Zionist organization in this country, is engaged in supporting the genocide in Gaza in one way or another, and that's the problem.
When you say that Jews are overrepresented in positions of power, political power in Europe, how much more or less represented would you like them to be?
Well, look, what I'm trying to do here is explain why it is the case that Jews are in an advantageous situation to be able to pursue Zionist policies. And that's,
but now you're linking Judaism and Zionism, which is exactly what you were trying to get away from by pretending your anti-Zionist views aren't anti-Semitic.
I am linking the two of them in the sense that they are more advantaged, which allows some Jews, the ones who are the most senior, tend to be more Zionist than the others, and they are able to use that power.
You've just admitted that the Jews, because they're powerful, promote Zionism. So you have been using Zionism as cover for your anti-Semitic views.
Well, it's a nice try, Jacob, but it's not the case.
Well, it seems to have worked, actually. You said it.
No, look, the reason that we have the Israelis are able to dominate certain elements of our politics in Parliament in terms of counter-extremism, in terms of counter-terrorism, is because, yes, of the Israel lobby, which is important, but also because Jews are overrepresented, and the Jews who are overrepresented in the senior levels of business and politics tend to be Zionists. There's hardly any anti-Zionists who are Jewish billionaires, for example. And so that actually gives them an advantage in discriminating against others, including, in particular, of course, the group in society who are the least advantaged, who are the most disadvantaged and the most discriminated against, which is, of course, Muslims, not Jews.
Well, I think you have, by your own words, made quite clear what your position is and have linked Zionism to Judaism, and that must be fundamentally anti-Semitic. Your right to free speech must be upheld, but by your own words, I think you've made your position very, very clear. So I'm now going to go to my panel. I've given you great opportunity to speak, but I do now want to go to my panel, the author and journalist Michael Crick and the editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie. Michael, I'm all in favour of freedom of speech, as are you, and I believe he's entitled to freedom of speech. But it seems to me that he is using anti-Zionism as an absolutely classic shield to try and protect him from an anti-Semitic charge.
I don't know. It's a minefield, this. I'd like to, hear more about what Mr. Miller has said and what he's written. There may be an element of him being certainly tactless, but it's such a difficult area, this, that the way in which the word Zionist is used in lots of different ways. It's used as a term of abuse by appalling anti-Semites as a way of not attacking Jews, but using attacking Jews, but using another name.
The key point...
and then when it comes to Israel, it can mean simply a belief in the state of Israel, or it can mean belief in an expanding state of Israel, greater Israel.
The key point that he made was that Jews are disproportionately represented in positions of power, and therefore they lobby for Zionism. And that was the point at which he was effectively bang to rights, that he was linking the two and saying the overrepresentation, which is a classic view of anti-Semites over the centuries.
Well, I think you've got to be careful about, this is so difficult. You've got to be careful about this whole thing about, that's what people have said over the centuries, and therefore, if you say it now, even though it might be true, that you are being anti-Semitic. For instance, are you not allowed to say that Jews are overrepresented, say, in the City of London or in the law, but you are perhaps allowed to say that Asians are overrepresented in the law or the City of London?
I think it depends how you phrase it. If you say overrepresented, you're implying that you disapprove of the representation. If you're saying the more Jews get into Harvard because they're better at the tests...
There's a way of saying it that isn't... I agree, that phrase overrepresented, I don't think actually David Miller says that, does he? What's the word he does? Did he? But anyway, it's just so difficult. Yes.
I took the trouble to read this very long report. Kelvin?
Among my Jewish friends, one of the issues that they have is that that people attack Israel as an easy way of actually having views about Jews which are not acceptable. So this kind of split between the two sides.
But you are entitled to criticise the Israeli government. You
yes,
must.
I'm not saying you're not. I'm not one of them, by the way. Mm-hmm. So I look upon him as one of the great wartime leaders of modern times. So there is that issue, right? There is the other issue that there are only 250,000 Jews in this country. I think there are only 6 or 7 million across the whole world now, or 7 million perhaps, right? So the idea of being overrepresentative, right? All it means is if you have been pursued for thousands of years from country after country, pogrom after pogrom, that it's no wonder that you have a sustainable intellectual, physical ability to take on enemies, right? In a way which, you know, lucky for me, Anglo-Saxon, I haven't had to face any of those. So I understand all that. For that guy there to go down that route, right, at his university, he must have known that it was all going to end in tears. I cannot, for the life of me, understand what was what. And nor could I understand why anybody felt that this was something which should be interfered with by the courts, right? It's up to the university whether they wanted to have that kind of view.
Well, surely he's got the right, as an employee, if he's lost his job, he's got the right to appeal and go to an industrial employment tribunal.
The idea that a court sits there and has to make some kind of judgment.
Well, they have to do that in all sorts of employment cases.
I find that ridiculous.
Reading the report, a lot of it was procedural. The only thing I would particularly criticise the court for saying his views have to be respected. Nobody's view ever has to be respected. You may think it's right to tolerate it. The two are completely different.